Even as Congress and the President fashioned and refashioned Reconstruction in Washington, black and white Southerners shaped the post-war world on the ground. They disputed the terms of work, housing, property, politics, and social relationships. For black Southerners, the first order of business was to create autonomous lives. True emancipation required not just free individuals, but communities dedicated to uplifting and supporting its members. Politically, Reconstruction entailed creating Republican governments that would implement the policies articulated by Congress. Politics monopolized the public's attention, but the success of Reconstruction and the ability of African Americans to make their freedom real hinged on rebuilding the Southern economy. A key change in Southern life came with the Freedmen's Bureau and their drive to build schools. Before the Civil War, no Southern state maintained a public education system. Northerners viewed education as essential to both political and economic progress. Many Northerners believed that non-slave-holding whites supported secession because they could not dissect the misleading rhetoric of slave-holding elites. African Americans in particular viewed education as essential. Beginning in contraband camps during the war, freed people sought out literacy. Denied to them as slaves, literacy and higher education promised a life beyond the fields and satisfied many people's desire to read the Bible themselves. People of all ages lined up at churches and schools where instruction was available throughout the day and usually well into the evening. Despite complaints from white Southerners about the cost, public education proved one of the lasting accomplishments of the Reconstruction-era governments. But greater access to formal education did not necessarily lead to greater economic mobility or equality. Even though the Civil War ended the split in the U.S. economy between free and slave labor, it did not equalize wages between the two sections or between the races. The South replaced slavery with a low-wage free labor system, and within that, African Americans consistently received lower pay for equivalent work done by white workers. Most black Southerners remained agricultural workers, but very few worked their own land. Instead, Southerners expanded a pre-war practice called sharecropping, in which landless workers signed contracts to take up residence in farm plots of land, often on property belonging to former slaveholders. In exchange for leasing land, property owners claimed 50% or more of the profits at harvest time. When sharecropping first came into use, it met the needs of property owners who required labor to farm the land, but had no money with which to pay wages and workers who wanted more autonomy. Sharecroppers set their own schedules and supervised themselves in the field, but crucially, it was usually landowners who chose the crop. All across the Deep South, and much of Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, that choice was cotton. Merchants, who were among the few actors in the post-war Southern economic system with access to credit, insisted on receiving cotton. The changes in the global cotton market, however, produced price fluctuations and great uncertainty for growers. Adding to the structural problems, white landowners exploited their laborers and merchants and squeezed them on prices for foods and supplies. Egypt and India also entered the global cotton market during the Civil War, adding competition and uncertainty for U.S. producers. As a result, sharecropping quickly trapped farmers in cycles of debt. Most signed the contracts hoping to produce enough to clear a surplus and over time accumulate the money to buy their own land, but this rarely happened and tenant farming dominated the South for the next 50 years. The results ultimately ensured overuse and poor treatment of Southern lands, a stunted regional economy, and little progress for African American farmers. The Republican state governments established after the constitutional conventions in 1867 and 1868 were fragile and awkward alliances between groups with widely divergent interests. Black Southerners represented by far the largest component of the party. They wanted to receive a genuinely fair opportunity to perform work, buy land, gain an education, and live independent lives. But white Northern Republicans, labeled carpetbaggers by conservatives because they assumed Northerners were only coming south to make quick money, focused on economic development. Usually pre-war Whigs or wartime Unionists, white Southerners rarely came to the Republican Party with any interest in black voting or civil rights. Instead, they rejected the Democrats as the party that had pulled the region into secession and war and hoped that a Republican commitment to free labor would create a firm foundation for the New South. Democrats, of course, eagerly exploited the tensions within the Republican Party. In many places, white conservatives had initially boycotted elections that resulted from the constitutional conventions of 1867 and 1868. Hoping to undermine the legitimacy of these new governments, they succeeded only in hastening Republican dominance. In other states, some conservatives made alliances with Republicans to create coalition governments. But the 1872 national elections, in which Ulysses S. Grant was reelected despite substantial opposition within his own party, revealed a weakness that Democrats longed to exploit. Beginning in 1873, white conservatives returned to the political system and used charges of corruption to defeat the Republicans. The wide scale of corruption within Grant's administration had even threatened his reelection. Also, the policies that Republicans implemented, especially public education, required new taxes. Before the war, slaveholders and large property owners shouldered most of the tax burden, but with no slave property to tax, post-war state governments imposed property taxes on a much broader range of people. Even though the children of white property owners benefited from public education, they often condemned the taxes required to pay for it. Democrats capitalized on these policy disputes and campaigned vigorously on the platform of white supremacy to retake state governments. In Louisiana, Alabama, and other southern states, this approach yielded electoral victories for Democrats in 1874, 1875, and 1876.